So welcome to all of you. Our today's guest is not a guest because Ricarda is member of our team. Ricarda is a postdoc in the group of melanchitri. She studies saline vegetation, and she started with sampling data in the coastal Baltic Sea, and now she moved to the Pannonian Basin, and maybe she will summarize the results and comparison of those two parts of habitats. So, Ricarda, it's yours.
Yeah, welcome also from my side. Thanks, Stenka, for the invitation and for having me. Welcome also to the people online. As Stenka said before, I'm working on salt-affected or saline grasslands already a couple of years. So I started working on them during my PhD, and then I did a little break and went to North America and studied some mountain meadows before I came back and started working at Masaryk University, where I study now for 2 years inland salt-affected grasslands. And because we have, I think, kind of a diverse audience today, I thought I will start with introducing this type and how salt-affected vegetation looks like in Europe and where it occurs. So I will start with a lot of pictures that I took during the last years. And then I will continue talking about the main driving factors, salinity and moisture, and how they translate to the vegetation patterns on a broad scale, but also on local level. And in a third part of my talk, I will talk about the role of ions and elements that contribute to salinity in the soil. So when we talk about salt-affected vegetation or salt marshes, saline meadows, there are many terms for it. Most people know them because they know them from the coast. And this is not surprising because the European coast is full of salt marshes. We miss them somehow here in the north because mostly because the coastline is just too rough. There's no suitable habitat to develop for them, but we find them along the whole Baltic Sea coast. We find them in the North Sea, and most of you will know the Wadden Sea area as a great example of diverse and valuable salt marshes. And then they continue down the Atlantic coast, and they're also widespread in the Mediterranean area. And they can occur either natural or semi-natural. And I try to show some examples of how this looks like. I start with examples from the Baltic Sea coast, which I know quite well, especially in its southern part. And at the Baltic Sea coast, we have a special situation because the Baltic Sea in general, I will correct myself in the second part of the talk, but in general, we have quite a low salinity in the seawater, and with that also more brackish conditions along the coast than saline. So naturally, salt marshes occur. They are only on a very small scale. But because we have maintenance of such coastal sites already going on for more than about 600 years, So the people there use them for cattle grazing, for sheep, or also for horses, or they also mow those areas. And this way, we nowadays have also along the Baltic Sea coast quite large salt grasslands. And especially here on this picture, on the bottom right of the slide, you see that grazing or maintaining these meadows is, when we do it in a suitable way, also good to keep the diversity up. So we see in the forefront of the picture some patches which are not grazed at all. We see here patches that are completely overgrazed, so there's no vegetation left at all. And we see everything in between as well. We see open water surface, which is also valuable. And in the background, this golden stripe, you see stands of reeds that, for example, are also in combination with those short swords valuable if you think about birds, for example, and their diversity in these habitats. And then I want to show you some more examples from the Baltic Sea, from the southwestern edge, and from the North Sea. And when I start at the with the upper pictures here, we see again there are these diverse patches of quite high, with Balboschönus maritimus here, quite high stands of, and then quite low, short grassland swards in the upper littoral zone in this, in both pictures. So we are here most far away from the water edge as we can be in an area which is still affected by saline water. But what we also have in these upper areas are open water patches, or I call them like ditches here, where salt water comes maybe during a storm event or during a high tide. And so, yeah, it's not the littoral zone, it's not a straight line of a gradient from highly saline and very moist to low saline and dry, but there are like breaks in this gradient, and this is on a small scale and on a larger scale, so we have also a very diverse microtopography. For example, also as a result of grazing animals that trample the area. And then on the lower part of the slide, you see examples from Speaker Oak, from the North Sea, and you see that here we are in the lower littoral zone, so as close as kind of possible for a grassland to develop at the water's edge. And you see one of the main features we have here is a long inundation time. So we have a long time standing water, or at least waterlogged conditions. And one of the species that is well known from this area is this lovely Limonium vulgare, sea lavender, also called in English, intermixed with, for example, Salicornia europea and other species that can deal with such high salinities and high soil moisture. That means that are adapted to salinity, for example, through succulents or other physiological adaptations. And when we go again a bit higher up, it's still a moist condition here, but we have less salt in the soil. And I can see that because we have here a very typical situation, because it's like a transitional grassland between the freshwater influenced grasslands and halophytic grasslands. So we find glycophytes, which I sometimes call now associated species, because they mostly grow in freshwater conditions, but they can deal with low amounts of salts as well. And we still have some halophytes here in this picture, like Lotus tenuis, for example. And if we go away from the coast, you see on this map, I didn't mention it before, mostly like 4 main Natura 2000 habitat types of saline vegetation. And the light blue ones are the ones I want to focus next. So those are the ones that grow on specific geological conditions. And you find them, for example, in the northern part of Germany, but also many of them in Poland. And here you see an example or 2 examples that are rather natural. The Soltauquelle is purely natural. It's a site where salt water kind of comes up from deeper soil layers and brings up salts from the Zechstein times. So the northern part of Germany was once a shallow ocean, and we had salty conditions there. And from those times, we still have deposits left that that are quite close to the ground in some parts. And when we have situations like here, where water presses up to the top, we have like this little saline lake in the middle of an agricultural field, actually. So we have salt-affected vegetation, like as a fringe developed here around the whole lake. And this is still the same lake. And we also have like a little outflow here because water is coming all the time. And it's quite nice to see that in this rather, let's say, boring agricultural landscape, you have suddenly a little stream going through where species like Glaucus maritima is growing, that you would expect to see when you go next time to the North Sea, but not in the arable field somewhere. And then there's another example I wanted to talk about. It's the Artenazolgraben. This has been a natural site. It is not anymore because now it's regulated by man. So the village is actually just next to it, or a little town. I don't know how it's defined, but actually, like here are the first houses already. So they prefer to regulate it, and they bring up water every winter and spring onto the area, which is quite saline, and then the water evaporates, and that way they maintain this very nice, highly saline area, which is actually, I have some soil samples from that area, the most saline site that I ever sampled personally. And then we have man-made sites from that are related to salt mining sites. These are also examples from Germany because it just happened that I have been there last summer. And you see 2 examples of mining sites. One site that was recently closed, like in the last, can't remember, 10 years or so, and one site which is already closed for more than 60 years and never has been as big as the example on top of the slide. So the Halde Siegfried, how it's called, is like this large area where they mined potassium salts, which are used for agricultural fertilizer mostly. And now we have this huge hill of salty deposits, and all around this hill we have, this photo is taken from somewhere here. So all around this hill we have this highly saline vegetation. And you see it's going quite far up there. So it's really huge mining deposit hill. And then in the second example, you see on the aerial photograph, it's kind of a weird situation because we are in the middle of Germany, in the middle of a forest. You expect a lot, but not to find an opening where species that usually grow along the coast suddenly appear. So there's no management in this area anymore. Nobody keeps it open, but the amount of salts in those deposited sediments and stones is still high enough to keep all the species away that cannot deal with the high amounts of salts, and to maintain this very lovely and diverse patterns of salt-affected vegetation. And you see I couldn't resist and did some plots in this area as well. So maybe I could say for Eva it's forest plots, but just to make some mess in the data. Okay, and then I would like to just shortly mention that we also have those types in the Mediterranean, which or this Natura 2000 types along the Mediterranean coast and also in inland Spain. I have been there once. I'm not a big expert on that, and I will not talk about them, but just for you to keep in mind that they exist as well. And then there is this type, this pink indicated Natura 2000 types, which I want to talk about, that contains salt-affected grasslands in the Pannonian Basin and in adjacent areas. So if we look a bit further, the reason why they are there is because we have a semi-arid to semi-humid climate in this area. Those are climate diagrams already from our recent study, and you see those type, or this Natura 2000 type, can be found already quite close to where we are now, south of Brno, and then it is distributed in Hungary, in Romania, in northern Serbia, in Austria as well, not to forget them. And you see that we have kind of a moist situation in the winter time, where the area is waterlogged, or when the soils are waterlogged, and then during summer the situation changes to a quite hot and dry late summer period. And what happens here is that in the winter time the salts in the ground in the deeper layers get dissolved from all the water, and then they rise with the capillary soil water up to the layers where they are either on top of the soil surface, really, so you see them as a white surface on top of the soils, or they are deposited somewhere in the root zone of the herbaceous plants, so somewhere within the, let's say, first 30 centimeters. So they are affecting the vegetation quite strongly, and this is how that can look like. Many of you might have heard about the Great Hungarian Steppe grasslands that are subsaline grasslands. and that they are mostly grazed by sheep, and you still have shepherds going through the steppe with the sheep, so no fenced situation here like we would have seen it at the coast. And then you have those drainage channels, those ditches going through some of them that, of course, because they are a bit lower, have a longer time water available. And you see already that the vegetation looks a bit more fresh and higher. And one of the species that we usually find there is Beckmannia eruciformis. And then on the bottom part of the slide, here in this left picture, and also here, you see salt-affected grasslands on like gentle hillsides in the very east of the area, actually beyond the mountains even. And here we have a very special plant growing, Camphorosma montpelliaca. It can deal with the salinity quite well, and it grows there as a perennial plant with quite strong roots. And although there's a lot of erosion happening along those hillsides, you see that Camphorosma can kind of hold with its roots the soil quite well, and all around the plant the soil gets eroded. So we have again a nice microtopography in this area. And then we have, if we look closer into the steppe, we have also many microtopographical levels in the steppe that are characterized by very different vegetation types. And I will show you some more on this slide. I will not go into detail for every picture, but you see that the different levels are well characterized by different plant communities or dominances of plants. So we have here again a high diversity of microtopographical levels and plant communities. And then we have another landscape type. Those are those salt pans, which function quite similar as the whole Pannonian Basin. So in winter, they are inundated or waterlogged. So I didn't want to say that the whole Pannonian Basin is inundated in winter, but at least the soils are waterlogged. And so when we have there in those pans water in winter, like you see here some leftovers on this picture, and then in the late summer season they completely dry up, and you have, for example, in this picture here, which was taken I think somewhere in northern Hungary, you have really the salts on top of the soil that make this whole lake bottom look white and shiny. And you only have very specialized plants growing there, like, what did I take there? Zuaeda pannonica, or like this grass species, Crypsis aculeata. And to summarize this first part of my talk, I just say again what we learned. So we know salt-affected vegetation occurs along the coasts in Europe, but also inland. And I knew I will forget to say, and that's why I put it here on the slide again, on the summary slide, that along the coasts we have mainly one salt that is responsible for the salinity, and this is sodium chloride. We all know it. But in the inland situations, not only in the Pannonian Basin, but also in the inland sites in Germany and in the Mediterranean, you have very different kinds of ions and elements, that contribute to salinity. And then we have natural sites, we have semi-natural sites that are maintained by mowing or grazing, and we have those anthropogenic sites, and we have a diverse microtopography, diverse vegetation in relation to diverse soil characteristics. And now I would like to switch to a second topic and look at those main drivers, which are salinity and moisture that should be clear by now. And I would like to show how they affect patterns on a broad scale, broad geographical scale, and on a local scale. And I will do that by showing you the study, or one of the studies I did during my PhD at the Baltic Sea coast. And the Baltic is quite nice, a quite nice study area for this topic because, as I said before, it's more brackish, but we have a huge gradient here. So it's true, most of it is rather in a brackish condition, but due to the opening towards the North Sea, we have a high gradient from the southwestern corner of the study area to the very northern tip, from higher salinities in the seawater that also affect, of course, the coast, to almost freshwater conditions in the very north. And in the same direction, we also have a tidal range gradient. So we have still tides of about 30 centimeter difference in the southwestern corner of the study area, and almost no tidal influence anymore in the north. And what we have here as well, of course, I talked about it a lot already, that within the gradient of the littoral zone, we have those microtopographical levels that also influence vegetation patterns. So what we did in this study, we took plot-based vegetation data, and just as a reminder, a plot always is like a certain spot in a homogeneous vegetation that we try to represent with that plot. And in each of those plots that we gathered in for this project, we had the information on the abundance of each species that is in that plot, and also the information on structural variables. So I did a lot of plots on my own, but I also added many, many more from the EVA data repository. So at the end, I came up with about 3,700 plots that were distributed along the whole study area. You see there are some gaps, and one main gap is here about the northwestern coast of the study area. But this is also due to the fact that the coastline does not really facilitate the development of coastal grasslands there. It's simply too steep and too rocky. So we had three main aims. First of all, we wanted to classify salt-affected grasslands along the Baltic Sea coast from one joint data set, because we have many countries that have parts of the coast. We have many different classification approaches, but there was not so far one study that tried to classify everything at once. So we tried to do that. We identified the plant communities, their characteristics, and their geographic distribution patterns. And this is exactly, of course, what I want to show you in a few minutes. And then we also tried to link the found plant communities to Natura 2000 types, and to identify communities that might be of importance for nature conservation. And if we look here at this DCA graph, we see it's not a big surprise on the first axis of the graph, where we put all our vegetation plots in, we see salinity is correlated with the first axis. So salinity is our main driver in this data set. And of course, where we have high salinity values, we also have a high amount of stress strategists, which in this case are halophytes, so well-adapted species. And on the second axis, we have moisture. And I can say that from many of those studies, those graphs always look the same. They always show us those two main driving factors. And if we look at this corner where it's, where we have the driest situation and the least saline situation, we see that a lot of strong competitive species come in. So they have no chance, because of the high salinity stress, to grow somewhere here. But as soon as salinity drops, they gain competitive strength again, and they also are part of salt marshes in the least saline communities. And to avoid going through all those subgroups, today I just give you 4 examples where we hopefully can see those main gradients on a broad and on a local scale. And the first example I want to show you is a group of plant communities that occurs only in the southwestern corner of the Baltic Sea coast. They are most similar to those communities that we find along the Atlantic and North Sea coast, although they are already a bit less saline or a bit more brackish. They are restricted by the range boundaries of coastal species like the one I mentioned before, Limonium vulgare, but also like other pronounced halophytes like Salicornia or Halimione species characterize these communities. And here we are very sure that we have, from a floristic point of view, from our species composition, we know it's the Natura 2000 type Atlantic salt meadows. And then when we go to some examples that show rather widespread distribution patterns that are not that saline anymore, somewhere here in the middle, and they grow like also in the littoral gradient somewhere in the middle. It's not that easy anymore to see to which of those Natura 2000 types they belong, at least if we only take into account the floristic composition here. Because on the one hand, they still have halophytes included that are typical for those sites, but that are not anymore adapted to those very saline situations. And we also have lots of glycophytic species already coming in. And then I want to show you a third type that fits quite well into the salinity gradient I showed you a few slides before. Just remember, so we saw the most saline communities here. We saw communities with kind of a medium salinity widespread in the area. And now I'll show you a community or several communities that are only found in the very north, where we have a very low seawater salinity. So we see those, this main driving factor of salinity works well when we look at our data on a broad scale. So this type is characterized by species that are of boreal Arctic origin, and we know for sure this type belongs to the Boreal Baltic coastal meadow Natura 2000 type. And they occur, if you look at the littoral zone, somewhere higher up. But then we also found this type, and it shows exactly what we didn't expect. It is a highly saline type, the second most saline type that we found in the whole data set. It occurs at the very top of the littoral zone, and it's highly saline. So what's happening here? We know the seawater is already very brackish, almost has freshwater characteristics, but there's a bit of salt left. And we also know that we almost have no tidal influence anymore in this area. So I showed in the map before, the influence of the tide is more or less zero. But what we of course have here, and what is also like an important driver at the Baltic Sea coast, is that we have storms. And those storms, especially in autumn and in winter, they bring up the saline water, or this almost fresh water, up into the higher littoral zones. And when we have ditches or small ponds up there, the water stays there for a long time. And even though the climate is not very warm, at some point the water will evaporate, and we have the little bit of salt that was in the water still left in this little ditch. And if that happens year after year after year, you finally have a highly saline ditch in the upper littoral zone, where we find, of course, plants that are adapted to highly saline situations. In this case, it's especially one species I want to mention. It's Puccinellia fruganodes, which only occurs here at its southernmost occurrence, and then next time it occurs up here at the Arctic coast, where it, in the littoral zone, because there we have again highly saline water, where it occurs at the very close to the water edge. So we don't only have this broad scale pattern, we also need to look at small scale patterns. And I can't add more to our summary than saying, yes, we see in our data that those main driving factors, salinity and moisture, do play a role on a broad geographic scale, but also on a local sites. And with that, I want to come to the last chapter of my talk, and I want to come to the topic of the role of ions and elements and their composition in the soil, and with that also to the project that I do here at Masaryk University. And I do that in the Pannonian Basin, so all my data are from the Pannonian Basin or the adjacent areas. So we went there 2 summers ago, actually, and collected a large data set. Again, we used plot-based data, but this time we didn't use abundance data, but we used presence-absence data for this very purpose. We also took in each of the plots soil samples from the upper soil layer, so from the first few centimeters, and we luckily were able to analyze all those soil samples with the great support of Michael Pawonic here from our soil lab. And he was the one, with the help of some students actually, that measured all those ions and elements that we would expect to contribute to salinity, and they also measured electrical conductivity, which we take as a measure for salinity itself. They measured pH, and they measured the sodium adsorption ratio, which tells us something about the amount of sodium in relation to the amount of calcium and magnesium, which is important because if there's too much sodium in the soil, plants are not able anymore to take up magnesium and calcium, which they of course need as well as nutrients. So at the end we came up with this data set. We also included some data from fellow colleagues that contribute to this study. So at the end we had roughly about 400 plots available from the whole area, and from all those plots we had data on the characteristics of the upper soil layer. And in this map here you see that only the salinity in categories, and you see that we have quite a high amount of plots that have like only a slight salinity level in the top soil level. But you see as well that all the other categories are well distributed in the whole study area, which makes this data set quite stable for analysis. And next to the question if salt composition matters at all, we came up with some more scientific driven hypothesis. So we stated that ions and elements that contribute to salinity also co-determine plant species niche differentiation. So in this project I went from vegetation patterns towards patterns in single species. And then we also ask which of those ions are most important for the occurrence of species. And we tried to answer this question by looking at species that are well adapted, like the halophytes, and at looking at species that are not adapted so much to salinity, the associated species, or what we also call glycophytes. And how did we do that? We started by calculating niche models by taking our presence-absence data from the plot from all the species, and by taking the 11 soil variables that we got from the lab work. And now we came up for about 60 species with niche models, single niche models for all the 11 soil variables. And also, additionally to that, to try to explore how important ions and elements are, or if they're important at all, we took only the soil data and we calculated PCA with it to see how the single ions and elements contribute to the variance in our data set. And we did another analysis, like another approach to kind of answer the same question, but this time on a single species level. So for every species that we could calculate niche models for, we also calculated the importance of the variables for the occurrence of each single species. And we did that by using random forest models. And we took the information that we got from the random forest and from the PCA, so the results that told us which of the variables are most important. We took that information together with the niche information and plotted kind of echograms for single species using 6 most important variables. And then we calculated from the random forest models that also give us information on the importance of every variable for every species occurrence, we calculated the differences in importance for every variable for either halophytes or for associated species. And this is one of the first results. This is a PCA we calculated. And I told you before, in every kind of this PCA, DCA graphs, we always see salinity on the first axis. But we didn't include it directly here because it was highly correlated to some of the ions. So we plotted it just like post hoc on the graph. But what we see is that with the first axis, sodium, sulfate, chloride, and carbonate are mostly correlated, so they contribute most to the variance on the first axis. And the first axis is also related to salinity, as we see here with the different colors. The same colors are used for the map before. So blue is again a low salinity, and towards the right side of the first axis we have higher saline plots. And I also plotted the SAR, only post hoc because it was again correlated, and I used the size of the dots for it. So small sizes means we have a low SAR, and high, larger sized plots means we have a high SAR. And then we plotted also the pH. It's not very much correlated to the first axis, but a bit. And you cannot see it from this graph, but pH is more correlated to the third axis, where we also have carbonates highly correlated, and carbonates and pH, like carbonates, high amount of carbonates drives like a high pH in the soil. So, so to summarize, the first axis here, those are our 4 main, most important variables, and I don't show the graph for the second axis here, but the same graph for the second axis shows that calcium and magnesium are also very important contributors to the variance in our data set. So we took these 6 ions and elements, these cations and anions, to draw our ecograms. And just by the way, the random forest models, which we use to calculate the importance of variables in a different way, told us, summarized over all species, gave us the same picture, which is always good if you try different approaches and they don't show completely different results, but they kind of add to each other. So it also, again, shows us that the data show a stable picture here. And in order to avoid showing you the ecograms of 60 plus species, I just took 2 species as an example that we kind of met before in my talk today. I chose Zuaida pannonica and Salicornia perenans. Both of the species are pronounced halophytes, highly adapted to very high saline vegetation soils, and they are both adapted by succulents. So they store a lot of water, kind of dilute the high amounts of salts they are forced to take up. And we see in our data, we don't see it now, we saw in our data that yes, we found also divergent niches of species towards those 6 important variables. So we see that not only salinity is important, but also the shares of ions or the composition of ions and elements adds to the picture when we look at the niches of different species. And if we look at the cations here, you cannot understand at all what I say because the niches look exactly the same. Yeah? Both species prefer to grow in calcium-rich, magnesium-rich, and sodium-rich soils. But if we look at the anions, we see they do have different niches. If we look at Zoaida pannonica, we see it also has high amounts of sulfates in the soil where it grows, but it's completely or more or less indifferent, broadly indifferent towards chlorides, and it really prefers to grow where we have high amounts of carbonates in the ground. And this picture is very different when we look at Salicornia, and we were wondering actually in the field that some of those salt pans we saw, there was no Salicornia at all, and suddenly in some others there was Salicornia growing, and we couldn't really understand why this is. And now we see it is because Salicornia kind of avoids growing in this carbonate-rich soils, although it still can deal with medium shares of carbonate, but it really tends to grow in soil with a high amount of chlorides. And if we go through the whole data set, we see continuously those different niches coming up. And if we want to say the same thing again in different words, we can say that both species grow in soils which are high in sodium sulfates and calcium sulfates, but Zoaida pannonica prefers to grow in sodium carbonate-rich soils, and Salicornia perennis prefers to grow in sodium chloride-rich soils that also have some magnesium chloride included. And with that, I want to go back to that question of which of those variables or ions and elements are important for either halophytes or glycophytes. And when I talk about importance now, I talk about their occurrence. So is this variable important for the occurrence of species of this group? Yes or no? And what we see when we kind of summarize the importance values that we got from the random forest models for either one of the groups, we see again that, oh sorry, wrong screen, that sodium and sulfide are most important for both species groups. So it's not a big surprise. We saw before in the data that sodium and sulfide are highly important. They are both correlated to salinity, the most important driver. But we also see that sodium and sulfates are more important for glycophytes than for halophytes. And this might be because it is more important for glycophytes to have soils where those two variables or those two ions or elements do not occur in high shares. So this graph does not tell us anything about if the value is high or low. It just tells us if this variable is an important factor for its occurrence or not. So either way, if it's low or high. And of course, I looked into the data, I summarized my niche graphs again and saw, okay, it is very important, obviously, that sulfates and sodium are only to a certain amount in the soil for glycophytes. They are still, of course, important for halophytes. We know why. They are well adapted, so it's no surprise. But then we see also chlorides and carbonates here that are both important, but much more important, significantly more important for halophytes than for glycophytes. And the question is why? And to be honest, I don't know. I don't know yet. It's a quite new result. If I think about those variables, I know they are a bit less correlated to salinity. They are, as we saw in the examples before, for some halophytes, very important, like for salicornia, it's very important that chlorides are high in the soil, so maybe it has something to do with adaptations to specific ions and elements of specific species, but I don't know, and I hope someday I will discuss it more and meet more people with more ideas, and I'm open for any suggestions. So with that, I can kind of conclude the whole summary to a take-home message for you. We also know now that ions and elements drive species niches next to salinity as the main driving factor and next to soil moisture, and that the importance of ions and elements differ for halophytes and for associated species. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention, and I want to thank all the people that supported me during the many, many years on this way of studying salt-affected vegetation. These pictures are taken from the lab work. You see maybe some faces you saw before in university. I had a great team also now in this last project, because these people are kind of having they have different expertise, which is quite valuable for such a broad project where you should know the vegetation quite well. So I had local experts there. I had people that knew or that did all the lab work for me. I got great feedback from many of them. I got nice discussions about statistics, and some people are sitting here, so thank you for that. And with that, again, thanks to you for your attention.
Yeah. So, it's yours. Yeah. Thank you for this nice talk. And I'm sure that we will have a questions or comments. So we can open the discussion.
Thank you, Ricarda. It was very clear and nice. Do you have more such interesting stories as you had for Salicornia and Sureda regarding their niches? Maybe you could have shown more than just two.
Yeah.
The graphs were very nice, illustrative, and also the results were very interesting.
Thank you. So yes, I do have more examples. Those two I showed are, I think, really the nicest one. Not only because the species are so special and specially adapted, but the pattern is so nice and clear. But we have more species involved. We also have halophytes that have their niches, for example, where both chlorides and carbonates are super high in the soil. I also have those patterns for species of different levels in the steppe vegetation. So species that occur together on specific microtopographical levels. We can see that they have also shared niches that are different from those that occur in different microtopographical levels, either higher up or lower. Yeah. But I hope we are just wrapping up a manuscript on this, and it's just in the hands of my co-authors right now. But we have, of course, many of those niche plots, so many appendices that are hopefully useful also for local botanists, not only for people that want to see the big pattern, but also for people that are interested in the field to maybe use those niches and this information on the variable importance or the ion and element importance to better understand the patterns they see in the field. Like the story I told with Salicornia, where we were kind of helpless understanding why Salicornia is not there, although the habitat looks the same in the next pond, and now we know. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. I hope I answer your question when I say that before we started analyzing those niches, we made sure that all of the species represent niches for are distributed in the whole study area. So there's not one species that kind of drops out halfway. So we don't have this influence. I'm not an expert on this historical part. Of course, those landscapes are all completely highly managed for many, many hundreds of years. So they all have kind of an influence of management everywhere. But I think I can just... Okay. I can answer it again if you want.
Because my impression was that the pasture has a really strong impact on this vegetation. And you also show that this is some patchy vegetation, something is overgrown, overgrazed, and something left. So really I thought that it is important. And in your graphs, in your analysis, you focused on the moisture and salinity. So you suppose that the pasture is everywhere and has a similar impact, or how it is with the management?
Yeah, it's first of all difficult with that management. I think I can better talk about those problems we have when we look at data from the coast. There are many studies that try to kind of show the influence of grazing or mowing. Mowing is fine because you can do experiments, you can really know where you did it and when. With grazing, it's very difficult, but because, first of all, those coastal meadows, and I think it's also true for the inland ones, if they get grazed, it should be not with a high stock rate, so it should be a low level of cows per unit or sheep per unit. But
of habitat could support some...
Yeah, for sure. I think that's the next step. I come to that. So the problem is with the data we have. Of course, we know that the disturbance by trampling and grazing is super important. It drives all these diverse structural patterns, and with that also the patterns of species occurrences. But we have struggled to know exactly, when it comes to grazing, where a cow grazed when, for how long. And especially if you have such a low density and you have many local factors, like if there is a street, if they try to avoid being there, the animals, if they are shy or if they are used to people. And there's a nice study, I forgot the name of that colleague. She really sat down and observed for many, many weeks how the kettle is moving in the area to get better data on it. But we really have struggled to get high quality data on the grazing effect, although we know very clear and very sure that the effect is there. Also, when you think about the microtopography again, of course the trampling, especially in those moist situations, has an impact because it compacts the soil and it brings it further down into the more saline area, and suddenly you have a highly saline spot in a less saline area.
Do there exist some studies which compare affected and somehow fenced habitats which are protected to those animals, so then you can really see the effect of these disturbances?
Yes, they exist. Again, I can more talk about the coastal areas here. They do exist, and they unfortunately exist easily because a lot of those meadows are abundant nowadays. This is one of the major problems we have when we think about nature conservation. This management, you can imagine such a coastal meadow is not very profitable to be grazed. You can only put a few animals there, otherwise the meadow will not be there and part of the sea in a few years. So we have many sites that are abundant, and with that we have also many studies that show that we lose diversity. It's like maybe two effects. It's like from the lower parts when we stop grazing in a brackish situation, for example, at the Baltic Sea coast, when we stop grazing, mostly Phragmites australis is coming in the lower littoral zone, and then Elytrigia repens, followed by Festuca arundinacea, for example, is coming in from the upper littoral zone, because it's getting less and less saline. There's no trampling of the soil anymore. There's no removal of the grasses and herbs anymore, and especially with Elytrigia that can build polycormones, right? They can easily go into those areas and kind of build up the area to higher levels again and make it less saline.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. So my question, how it is with the Salicornia? How I shall name the species of European Salicornia? My impression is Salicornia europea for me. I saw that you have some different names. So is it one species or there are more species in Europe? How it is?
Yeah, I have no idea. I know that the taxonomy, I was afraid this question will come when I show Salicornia and I name it per enans. I think, as far as I understand Salicornia, it's a very difficult taxon. There are taxonomists working on that, and those papers are often, the title of those papers often sounds like a very difficult story, not yet solved. Here another example. And if we go to the Mediterranean, where we also then have Sarcocornia as a similar genus, it's getting even more complicated. Like as a general pattern, I asked that once Milan, and he told me, in this area we call it Salicornia per enans. And I went for it. And I know colleagues in Poland and Estonia, they distinguish per enans and Europea, and they state they have both there and maybe even more. Then along the Atlantic you have further species like Ramosissima and all that stuff I'm not into. And then in the Mediterranean I'm completely lost when it comes to Salicornia and Sarcocornia. So I try to kind of aggregate and go with like more a regional concept, and there's for sure a lot of taxonomic work still to do.
Thank you.